I can still remember the exact moment everything shifted, not just the walls of our home, not just the look in his eyes, but something deeper, darker. The way your skin crawls when someone you trust becomes a stranger in your own house. It was the sound of Craig's voice that made my blood turn cold, not because it was loud, not because it was angry, but because it was so calm, so casual, like he was ordering a sandwich instead of tearing apart the life we'd built together for 15 long years. He stood there in the kitchen, where I'd made him breakfast every morning for over a decade, where I'd scrubbed grease off pans while he napped on the couch during layoffs, where I'd kissed his forehead after every hospital visit and told him it would be okay. And with a smirk curling at the corners of his mouth, he said the words I will never, ever forget. Now I'm rich. I don't need a housewife anymore. I should have slapped him, screamed, called my sister, thrown something sharp and heavy. But I didn't do any of that. I just stood there, the sweat cooling on my back from the run I'd just finished, holding the mail in my hand like an idiot, with my wedding ring still glinting like a joke in the afternoon sun. Let me rewind. Let me tell you who I used to be before everything went up in flames. My name is Emma Hale. I met Craig in college when he still had that big dream energy in his eyes, talking about starting a real estate firm and becoming the kind of guy who never needed to check his bank balance. I worked 2 jobs while he finished grad school. I typed his papers when his hands were shaking too much from stress. I rubbed his back during panic attacks. I covered rent when his commissions dried up. And when he had a tumor scare at 37, I spent 3 weeks sleeping on a plastic chair in the ICU while he wept in his sleep and begged me not to leave. I didn't. Of course I didn't. So when he called me from the gas station, barely able to breathe, telling me he'd bought a lottery ticket on a whim and won $20 million, I screamed with joy. Not because of the money, not really, but because I thought maybe, finally, the universe was giving him a win. Giving us a win. But a win that big? It doesn't give. It takes. And God, did it take everything? The first few days were euphoric, champagne in plastic cups, spontaneous dancing in the kitchen, sex in the middle of the day like we were 20 again. He looked at me like I was a miracle, and for once, I believed I was. We dreamed together. We talked about a vacation to Italy, paying off the mortgage, starting a foundation to help kids aging out of foster care. He said things like, "We deserve this, babe, after everything we've been through." But by the end of that week, the dream started curdling around the edges. He started leaving the house at odd hours, brushing off my questions with vague answers and tighter smiles. The bank meetings became private. The financial advisor, a woman named Tawny, who he insisted just understands how to manage sudden wealth better. The man who once asked my opinion on everything from what tie to wear to which soap smelled better in the bathroom now acted like I was a speed bump on his highway to reinvention. Then came the first card decline. My grocery run, nothing fancy, just chicken, broccoli, and some toothpaste, came to $72. When I swiped my joint card, it flashed red. Declined. The woman behind me tapped her foot like I was stealing her time. I laughed it off, swiped again, declined again. I ended up using my emergency credit card, the one Craig didn't know I still had. When I got home, Craig was out. I logged into the account and found it empty. Not just empty, closed. The next morning, he handed me a manila envelope like it was a menu. Inside, a letter from a lawyer I'd never met and a single page of preliminary separation terms. There was no settlement, no mention of the house, and no explanation. Just a dry, typed paragraph stating that since the lottery ticket was purchased in his name, the winnings were non-marital property, and he was choosing to reassess his financial commitments. I looked up at him in disbelief. And he said it again, this time with even less emotion. I don't need a housewife anymore. Then he turned and walked out the door. And just like that, I wasn't Emma Hale, devoted wife of Craig Hale anymore. I was Emma, nearly 40, jobless, homeless, and stunned. A woman standing on the front steps of her own home with a reusable grocery bag and no keys in her hand. But here's what Craig didn't count on, what so many men don't count on when they think they've played you for the last time. He forgot that while he was building his next chapter, I was watching, listening, and remembering everything. And what he doesn't know is that this housewife, she's got a plan. It's a strange kind of numbness that settles in your bones when you realize your entire life has been snatched away with a signature on a letterhead you didn't even know existed. That night, I sat in the rain outside what used to be my house, my knees hugged to my chest like I was trying to fold myself small enough to disappear. I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. I couldn't. Because sometimes the grief doesn't come in sobs, it comes in silence, in the way your lungs refuse to fully expand and your heartbeat stumbles like it's suddenly unsure of its rhythm. I stared at the front porch light that still flickered like it had for years, a tiny reminder of all the things I'd put off fixing because life always came first. Funny how that same broken bulb now mocked me, blinking like Morse code for, "You are no longer welcome here." Craig hadn't even given me the decency of a goodbye. Just a shut door, a cold smile, and a lawyer's name scrawled on paper like it was a grocery list item. Divorce, item 1. Dignity, item 2. I walked for almost an hour in the dark, passing houses I'd waved at for years, families I used to bake cookies for during the holidays, couples I once hosted for wine nights in the backyard. Not a single door opened. Not a single curtain twitched. It was as if my erasure had already begun. Eventually, I ended up on the porch of the one person who would always open the door no matter what hour I came knocking. Jules. My best friend since college. A woman who wore eyeliner like war paint and walked like she owned whatever ground dared to exist beneath her heels. When she opened the door and saw me, drenched, shaking, with mascara like charcoal streaks down my face, she didn't ask a single question. She just stepped aside and said, "Took you long enough." For the next 3 weeks, I slept in her guest room, which was really just her walk-in closet with a futon shoved between racks of vintage blazers and statement coats. I didn't mind. In fact, it felt like the safest place in the world, wrapped in the scent of cedar and expensive perfume, lulled to sleep by the comforting sound of her espresso machine spitting steam every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp. It's amazing how little you realize you need until everything is gone. A clean towel, a hot coffee, a pair of shoes that actually belong to you. Each item felt like a small miracle. I started making lists in my head of what I'd lost. My husband, my home, my name in the deed, my car which was registered in his name, the dog who apparently now only answered to new girlfriend. But slowly, with each passing day, I started replacing that list with a new one, what I still had. The ability to rebuild. The strength to endure. The mind to adapt. I applied for jobs like a woman possessed. Administrative assistant, front desk clerk, bookstore cashier, personal chef. I even interviewed for a dog walker position despite being allergic to half of God's furry creations. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon filled with the kind of spring sunlight that always felt too hopeful, Jules tossed a folded-up flyer on the kitchen island and said, "You should apply to this." It was printed on thick cream cardstock, with just 3 lines of text in bold serif. Wanted. Personal assistant. Discretion required. Resilience a must. Inquire at 58, Colden Terrace. No name. No company. No phone number. Just an address in the wealthiest neighborhood in the county, a place where the driveways were longer than my old street, and the gates looked like they were built to withstand a siege. I hesitated. Jules didn't. She grabbed my purse, stuffed the flyer inside, and said, "Worst case scenario? You get a story. Best case? You get your life back." So I went. 58, Colden Terrace was not a house. It was an estate, carved into the hillside like a monument to the phrase money talks, but wealth whispers. The gates opened before I even reached the buzzer. A silent camera tilted toward me, then clicked away. I walked the gravel path in borrowed heels that pinched my feet and a blazer from Jules' collection that smelled like rose and quiet rebellion. A woman met me at the door, tall, lean, in a silk blouse so crisp it could have cut glass. She didn't introduce herself, just looked me up and down and said, "Follow me." We didn't talk until we reached a glass-walled study that overlooked a koi pond so still it felt unreal. That's where she turned, finally locking eyes with me. And in that instant, I understood I was standing in front of someone who'd eaten women like me for breakfast and still had room for seconds. "I'm Lorraine DeVoe," she said, voice smooth but sharp, like velvet wrapped around a blade. "You're here because you have nothing. I'm offering you a chance to change that." She didn't blink. Neither did I. She motioned to a chair. "Sit. I have 3 questions, and I only want real answers." I sat. My palms itched. My spine stayed straight. "Number 1, she began. "What did you lose?" "My marriage. My house. My name," I said, not flinching. "And my illusion that loyalty means anything to some men." Her lip curved upward, just slightly. "Number 2. What do you want?" "A life that no one can take from me again," I said, steady as steel. "Number 3, she leaned in, her perfume heady with jasmine and ruthlessness. "What are you willing to become to get it?" I took a breath, and it wasn't just air, it was purpose, inhaled and ignited. "Whatever I need to." She smiled. Not warm, not cruel, just intrigued. "You start tomorrow." And just like that, I became the assistant to Lorraine DeVoe, real estate tycoon, shadow magnate, the kind of woman whose name never appeared on the news, but whose influence you could feel in the skyline of every major city. She didn't do small talk, didn't tolerate mistakes, and believed that punctuality was not just a habit, but a religion. The first weeks were brutal. I was given a schedule that started at 4:45 a.m., a phone that rang at all hours, and access to a life I didn't even know existed. I fetched obscure herbal teas from international markets, hand-delivered contracts to developers in the middle of nowhere, and once, at 3:12 in the morning, drove 2 hours just to retrieve a set of antique keys she had a hunch would be needed. They were. But in the cracks between commands and cold directives, Lorraine began teaching me subtly, deliberately, like she was testing whether I deserved the blueprint to a life most people would kill for. She'd leave books on my desk: real estate law, negotiation psychology, high-stakes investment. She started looping me into meetings, at first as a silent observer, later as the one taking notes, and eventually the one pitching counter-offers. And one night, 6 months after I stepped into her world, she poured us both a glass of wine, handed me a manila envelope, and said, "You're ready." Inside was the deed to a duplex in a transitional neighborhood under my name. She'd acquired it for a fraction of its value during a quiet foreclosure. "Fix it up," she said. "Flip it. Use the profit. Learn. Build. This is your test." So I did. I learned tile and paint, staging and sales, budgets and permits. I burned my hands and bruised my knees and bartered with contractors like my life depended on it. Because in many ways it did. For months later, I sold it for 3 times the purchase price. And Lorraine didn't congratulate me. She handed me another file. "A warehouse on the edge of the arts district. Don't flip this one," she said. "Turn it into something that breathes." So I did. And as I walked through those gutted rooms with sawdust in my lungs and plans in my pocket, I finally understood. Craig hadn't just kicked me out. He had freed me. He had no idea what he started. And I had no intention of ever going back. It began the way most things do in my world now, not with a scream or a bang, but with a folder dropped silently onto my desk, its contents heavier than any gunshot. Lorraine didn't speak when she handed it over. She didn't need to. The moment my fingers brushed the thick manila paper and felt the sharp corner graze the inside of my palm, I knew it was something that would change everything. I opened it slowly, deliberately, like I was peeling back the layers of my own past. And there he was, Craig Hale, my ex-husband. The man who once said he didn't need a housewife anymore. The man who had kicked me out of my own life like I was just another unpaid bill. His face stared back at me from the glossy pages of an investigative report. He looked different now. Thinner. Paler. That smug, self-congratulatory gleam in his eye had dulled into something twitchier, tighter, like a gambler who knows he's playing with borrowed chips. I flipped through the documents without saying a word, though every nerve in my body buzzed with a cocktail of nausea and vindication. Lorraine leaned against the edge of my desk with that impossible stillness of hers, watching me closely, sipping from a cup of tea that smelled like betrayal sweetened with vengeance. Craig was hemorrhaging money badly. What started as a few luxury expenses had ballooned into a full-blown implosion. Private chefs flown in from Milan for single-night dinner parties. Backroom poker games with men who never left empty-handed. Jewelry bought for women who barely remembered his name. Boats, watches, investments in tech startups that never made it past a landing page. All of it funded by the dwindling remnants of his lottery win, and now, Lorraine's report noted, with cold finality, his mansion, our mansion, was quietly in pre-foreclosure. It would have felt satisfying, maybe even poetic, if it hadn't felt so inevitable. Craig was never built for wealth. He was built for the idea of it. And once the reality set in that money wasn't a fountain but a fire hose, he did what he always did when faced with limits. He pretended they didn't exist. "You want it back, don't you?" Lorraine asked, voice smooth as silk cut with iron. I didn't answer immediately. I closed the folder, pressed my palms flat against the desk, and looked her square in the eyes. "I don't want the house," I said, voice low and steady. "I want to buy it out from under him. I want to own the very foundation he thought he could exile me from." A flicker of something passed through Lorraine's expression. Satisfaction, maybe. Or something older. Deeper. "There's more," she said, lifting her teacup again. "Something you should know before we proceed." I waited. She paused. Her eyes, normally cool and unreadable, held something sharper now. Something personal. "I knew your husband," she said finally, her tone clipped and deliberate, like each word was a blade being laid on the table. "Years ago. Before the lottery. Before you. Before any of this." The room stilled, the way the air does right before a thunderstorm ruptures the sky. "You what?" "I met him at a development conference in Napa," she continued, crossing her arms, her posture shifting just slightly, straighter, colder. "He was young, hungry, ambitious in the way men are when they think charm is a substitute for character. He tried to pitch me on a hotel renovation deal. Said he had partners. Said he had funding. None of it existed. I didn't speak. I barely breathed. He lied, not just about the deal. About everything. Took money under false pretenses from 3 investors I introduced him to. Burned all of them. One lost her business. One lost her home. One," she trailed off, her jaw tightening. "One was my sister." My breath caught in my throat. Lorraine looked away for a fraction of a second, the closest thing I'd ever seen to vulnerability in her. "She killed herself 3 months later," Lorraine said, her voice now sharp enough to cut through steel. "Craig Hale didn't just ruin lives. He buried them." There was a silence that followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Charged. A kind of silence that you only hear when the universe is waiting to see if you're strong enough to act. "I want that house," Lorraine said, with a calmness that chilled the bones beneath my skin. "Not just as a property. As a symbol. As justice. As restitution." "Why come to me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because he destroyed your life too," she said, stepping closer now. "And because you're the only person who can get close enough to scout it without raising suspicion. You know its bones. You know the cracks. You know where it bleeds." The deal was simple in theory, impossible in sentiment. I would pose as a silent partner for a new buyer, one of Lorraine's shell companies. I would request a private viewing of the property, pretending to represent an international client seeking discretion. I'd photograph everything: foundation, structural issues, valuables he might be liquidating on the side. Lorraine would use my report to drive down the price through aggressive negotiation and eventually buy the property outright before the bank could list it publicly. And when it was done, when the papers were signed and Craig was ousted from his last delusion of grandeur, Lorraine would hand me the keys. "Do we gut it?" I asked. "Or do we leave it exactly as it is?" Lorraine's smile was slow, brutal, and beautiful. "We restore it," she said, "to what it could have been. What he never deserved." I smiled then, for the first time in months. It wasn't joy. It was reclamation. Power. The taste of justice laced with memory and granite. 3 days later, I was standing on the marble steps of the mansion I once called home. My heels clicked against the stone with the same rhythm I used to use to time my heartbeat in the early mornings when Craig was still asleep, and I used to wonder how many more years I could love someone who only loved me when he was broken. The real estate agent was new, young, chipper, clueless. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? The woman she saw was polished, cold, professional. Emma Hale was dead. This was someone else entirely. I toured the house with polite disinterest, masking the ache in my chest with every step I took. The hallway still had the runner I picked out in Madrid. The kitchen still had the burn mark from the night Craig tried to flambe dessert and nearly set the place on fire. The upstairs bathroom still had the chip tile he never got around to fixing because he said life was too short for grout and glue. I took photos, documented every flaw, every weakness. Noted the sagging beams behind the solarium and the termite damage in the guest wing. I ran my hand along the edge of the fireplace mantel and whispered, quietly, to no one, "I built this." And in that moment, I felt something shift. Not guilt, not sadness, ownership. The woman Craig had replaced me with wasn't home. But I found her shoes in the closet, 8 pairs of red-bottom heels she couldn't walk in, and a half-used bottle of perfume that smelled like desperation and vanilla. The agent asked if I was ready to place an offer. I smiled. "I think my client will be very interested," I said. When I returned to the car, Lorraine was already on the phone with her lawyer. She looked up when I handed her the drive with the photos. "Well, it's a disaster," I said. "We can knock 50% off asking and still come out ahead." "Good," Lorraine said, eyes flickering with something dangerous. "Let's bury him with his own bricks." As we drove away, the mansion loomed in the rearview mirror like a ghost finally exorcised. Craig thought he had erased me. But I was coming back not as the woman he left, but as the reckoning he never saw coming. They say revenge is best served cold, but they're wrong. It's not the temperature that matters. It's the timing. And on the day of the sale, when the ink was still drying on the final appraisal, and the house I once scrubbed, loved, and wept in was officially changing hands, I made damn sure the timing was surgical. The weather was flawless, one of those rare days where the sky stretches wide and shameless, like it knows something nobody else does. Lorraine and I stepped out of the car like storm fronts cloaked in tailored lines and brutal grace. She wore charcoal gray with silver jewelry sharp enough to wound. I wore navy so dark it might as well have been midnight, with heels tall enough to crush a past underfoot. Craig had no idea. That was the delicious part. He'd been told the buyer was a foreign equity fund, one of Lorraine's many faceless umbrellas, operating under the bland, bloodless name of Colden West Holdings. The kind of entity men like Craig expect to sell their crumbling estates to when they're finally forced to accept that bankruptcy doesn't always knock, it just walks in. He was already inside, smiling that empty, performance-ready grin he always wore when pretending not to be drowning. The real estate agent, a different one this time, older and visibly nervous, greeted us at the front with sweaty hands and forced cheer. "Mr. Hale is expecting you in the study," she said. Lorraine merely nodded. I didn't speak. Not yet. Not until I wanted him to hear my voice, and only when I was ready to use it like a weapon. The study was smaller than I remembered. Strange how rooms shrink once you've filled them with ghosts. Craig stood behind the desk I used to polish every Sunday, his cufflinks gleaming, tie knotted tight, confidence puffed up like a balloon seconds before the pop. He didn't look at me. Not because he recognized me, he didn't. He couldn't. He looked at Lorraine, measuring her like a man trying to guess the price of a watch he couldn't afford. He extended a hand. Pleasure to meet you. I'm Craig Hale. I assume you're representing the firm. Lorraine gave a small, controlled smile and shook his hand. I'm the buyer, she said simply. Craig blinked. Not because he didn't believe her, but because that hadn't been the plan. The firm was supposed to send a junior associate, someone easily manipulated, easily distracted, easily disarmed by charm and desperate pitches. I see, he said, recovering. Well, I'm sure you'll be very pleased. This property's been appraised at double what I'm asking. A real steal if you move quickly. I watched his mouth move as he spun the pitch, all the while oblivious to the fact that the person standing silently beside Lorraine wasn't just another colleague, or an assistant, or an intern, but the woman he had once told to get out without so much as a suitcase. He didn't even flinch when I sat down. Not until I opened the folder. Not until I pulled the papers out myself and laid them on the desk, directly in front of him. And signed. He stared at my hand, then my wrist, then my face. And froze. Not metaphorically. Not figuratively. He froze. Like a man whose brain had just misfired so violently that reality itself couldn't catch up. Emma, he said, barely above a whisper. I kept signing. Not a twitch. Not a blink. He looked to Lorraine, then back to me, then back again, searching for some confirmation that he hadn't just stepped into a nightmare scripted by his worst decisions. What the hell is this? Lorraine tilted her head slightly, a gesture I'd come to recognize as the prelude to a verbal kill shot. This is justice, she said, folding her arms. And maybe a little poetry. I stood, slowly, savoring every millimeter of the motion. The air in the room had changed. Thickened. His arrogance had shattered like cheap porcelain on tile. I don't understand, Craig stammered, the pink already draining from his face. This property is listed under personal assets. You can't just… What is she even doing here? Lorraine smiled, small and lethal. She's the buyer. Craig turned to me then. Full face. Panic creeping in behind his eyes like rising water. You can't be serious. You're buying the house. Yes, I said, finally speaking. But don't worry. I leaned in, close enough for him to smell the lavender oil I dabbed behind my ears this morning like armor. I'll take good care of it, I whispered, my voice laced with venom silk. After all, you didn't need a housewife, remember? He reeled back as if slept. And I let him. Let him sit there in his custom chair, his crumbling empire reduced to a signature and a woman he underestimated so thoroughly he couldn't even process the trap until it was sealed. I walked through every room of that house that afternoon like I was reclaiming a body that had been stolen. Each window I opened let in air that hadn't felt free in years. Each light switch I flipped was a declaration. I am not a victim. I am not a relic. I am not gone. In the kitchen, I stood exactly where I had stood the day he told me I was no longer needed. I remembered the way his voice sounded when he said it, soft, smug, final. And I remembered how I'd said nothing in response. Now, I owned the room. Lorraine joined me there, her gaze sharp, as always. You handled that well, she said. I've been rehearsing it every night for a year, I replied, pouring myself a glass of water like it was champagne. We keep the name off the records for a while, she continued. Let him stew. Let the foreclosure rumor ride the wave. Good, I said. Let him feel the consequences he thought would never touch him. She nodded, then hesitated. There's one more thing, she said, pulling a small envelope from her coat pocket. The woman. The new one. She's not just a gold digger. Oh, I said, raising an eyebrow. She's a plant, Lorraine said. One of mine. I embedded her 6 months ago when the foreclosure signs started flashing. Her name's not Clarissa. It's Natalie. She's been feeding me every detail, where the money went, who's circling the estate, what Craig's next moves are. I blinked, stunned for the first time in weeks. You put someone inside his life? I told you, Lorraine said, smiling without warmth. This was never just business. It was personal from the beginning. I stared at her, realizing the magnitude of what we'd done. This wasn't revenge. This was reclamation. This was empire building. This was two women, cut from pain and fire, carving power from the ashes of every lie a man ever told us. We didn't just win. We made history. Craig Hale unraveled slowly, almost politely, as if his downfall were something he thought he could schedule, pencil in between brunch reservations and half-hearted poker games that bled his bank account dry. At first, the signs were subtle. A declined card at the wine shop he used to frequent with women who had names he couldn't remember the next morning. A BMW repo notice tucked discreetly under his windshield, while he laughed too loudly at jokes he didn't understand. But then came the avalanche, the foreclosure letters he tried to ignore until the locks changed, the calls from debt collectors that grew louder, angrier, hungrier. By the time his so-called friends began ghosting his calls and his social media posts shifted from champagne to vague motivational quotes about rebuilding, it was already too late. Lorraine didn't destroy him. He did that himself. All we did was hold up the mirror and let him witness the collapse of a man who built his ego on credit and charm with no substance to hold the weight. I never spoke to him again after that final signing. Not because I wanted to hurt him more, but because I had already stopped needing anything from him. That's the thing about peace. It doesn't come when you prove your enemies wrong. It comes when you no longer need to. Lorraine's empire expanded like wildfire after that. She began acquiring properties under my name, and then under the brand we built together, Wren Hollow Developments, a name chosen not for beauty, but for symbolism. Wrens, small and underestimated, yet resilient, songbirds that know how to hide their power until the moment is right. And hollows, the spaces carved by time and storms, only to be filled again with life. Within a year, we had flipped 8 properties, converted 3 into boutique rentals, and started acquiring legacy buildings that other developers had given up on. Lorraine had her reasons, some personal, some strategic, but all of them spoke to a hunger I now understood deeply. The hunger to not just reclaim, but to reshape. I didn't wear revenge like a badge. I wore it like silk, quiet, deliberate, woven into every firm handshake and flawlessly written contract. When people tried to ask how I had risen so quickly, how I had transitioned from discarded housewife to property queen, I just smiled and said, experience. They didn't know the half of it. The mansion became my anchor. Not because of the memories it held. Those I exorcised with every wall I repainted, every floorboard I replaced, but because of the view. From the balcony off the master bedroom, the one Craig always said was too windy to enjoy, you could see the entire valley stretch out beneath you like a map of possibilities. Every time I stood there with my coffee, wrapped in a silk robe I bought with the profits of my first development deal, I reminded myself of one truth. I had made it. And no one, no man, no lawyer, no memory, could take that from me. Lorraine visited sometimes, though rarely. She was always busy, always working 3 steps ahead of whatever the world thought was her next move. But when she did come, we would sit on that balcony together in silence, 2 women who had earned the right to say nothing and still be understood. I don't hate him, I said one night when the stars were unusually clear and the wine unusually warm. I know, she replied. That's why you won. And I had. Not just in business. Not just in name. But in the slow, quiet way that healing comes not with fireworks, but with stillness. I no longer dreamed of Craig. I no longer flinched when his name came up in headlines, usually followed by words like disgraced, bankrupt, or filed suit against. I had outlived the version of me he tried to bury. And now? I was thriving. But life doesn't leave clean endings. It loves its shadows, its ellipses, its last-minute reveals. It was late one evening, almost midnight, when I returned from a site visit to one of our new developments, exhausted but satisfied. The security lights were still on in the driveway, illuminating the stone path and the freshly trimmed hedges that surrounded the estate like sentries. I pulled my coat tighter around me, stepped onto the porch, and nearly dropped my keys when I saw him. Not Craig. Someone else. He was leaning casually against one of the stone columns, hands tucked into the pockets of a well-tailored coat, his hair a little longer than I remembered, but the same eyes, sharp, steady, familiar in a way that hit somewhere beneath the ribs. "Hello, Emma," he said, voice smooth but tinged with something deeper. I froze, not out of fear, but recognition. "Aiden?" I said, stepping back slightly, stunned by the sight of him. Aiden, my before Craig. The man I once thought I would marry until life, geography, and dreams pulled us into opposite orbits. We hadn't spoken in over 17 years, but here he was, standing on the porch of the house I had stolen back from the man who replaced him. "What are you doing here?" I asked, voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. He smiled softly, that lopsided grin that once made me believe in quiet mornings and long drives to nowhere. "I saw your name in a closing brief for a downtown property," he said. "Took me a few weeks to confirm it was really you. And you just showed up?" "I was in town," he said. "And curious." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stared at a man who belonged to a chapter one thought had been closed permanently. But life is messy. Memory is elastic. And sometimes, doors you thought were locked forever creak open at the oddest hours. "You've changed," he said, eyes flicking over the house behind me. "You haven't," I replied. He smiled wider, the years falling off his face like old dust. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," I said. "Just unexpected." A silence stretched between us, heavy and unspoken. "I should go," he said, stepping back. "Or you could stay," I replied before I had time to stop myself. He didn't answer with words. He just nodded once. I let him in. And for the first time in years, I felt the spark of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since I walked out of that house with nothing but my pride and a reusable grocery bag. Possibility. Not revenge. Not redemption. Just beginning. Because despite everything I had lost, and everything I had reclaimed, I realized something that night as I stood beside Aiden in the doorway of the mansion I now owned. He thought it was over when he kicked me out. But my story is just beginning.